morning. Welcome to part 2 of this pond restoration. Hope you all had a nice bank holiday weekend. Back on the site this morning, a little bit cloudy, a little bit chilly as well. Today is going to be the first day where we start to actually build and construct the pond. Now we've still got quite a few jobs to do before we can actually tackle laying the first few stones. This pile of York crop stone here needs to be played around with so that I can start to split it and get some different shapes and sizes. Being cropped rather than the natural walling that I frequently use on jobs means that it's already been sort of trimmed and gauged, so most of this stuff is pretty uniform. Some of the bits are a little bit broader than I'd like to use, so I'll end up splitting them and I'll be able to get sort of 2 stones out of the one with 2 usable faces, but the vast majority of it is usable in terms of its width. I just want to make sure that I've got a nice selection of different thicknesses, some thicker pieces, some thinner pieces, and this will split quite nicely. So I'll spend a little bit of time with the bolster and the mallet, just working my way along, splitting, making a selection of different size rocks. Dave will be on the mixing duty as always, and then we can get the pond drain down and we can start to lay some of this stone. First day of rock laying. That was a good day's progress. I'm pleased with that. It was getting a little bit hot yesterday. So having laid rock and almost completed the first wall or the first face of the pond, I'm now moving on to the next side of the pond, and it's really important that I follow a true right angle. Obviously right from the beginning of this job, I've been using the paving within that shelter beside the pond as my kind of reset. Everything from the slabs, from the pointing in there, is being shaped from that. So as previously when I was cutting the outline of the pond, I've taken a string from inside the shelter, mirroring or running parallel to the slabs in there, the pointing. And then, like a game of operation with lots of other strings that you shouldn't be touching, although there's no buzzers going off, I ran a second string so that I could then have some form of reference reasonably close to the stonework that I was laying yesterday, so I could make sure that that was nice and straight, something to follow. And then from this original guideline, I'm now able to take a 90-degree right angle using a very handy little foldable protractor or square, and then run a second string, which again I can follow. Now again, there's a certain amount of tolerance here. It doesn't have to be 100% square. I can manipulate and move the paving a little bit if there are any discrepancies there, but the use of this is very, very helpful just to make sure that it is square. You could use a little block. I mean, I was using initially a block when I was cutting out the concrete, but this section I need to have a little bit more accurate than that concrete pad, because that's of course going to be concealed and hidden with the paving. So hence the use of the square here. And I'm just making sure that one edge of the square is parallel with the main set string, and then the new string is parallel with the right angle. That's all good. I've got to make sure that this doesn't get biffed or moved too much whilst I'm laying the stone, which is always a little bit tricky. And I can now start to lay the second face of rock. So I've made a great start in building up the stonework around the edge of the pond. I've completed almost 3 sides now. But before I get too carried away, I need to start integrating some of the pipe work and the connections. The overflow pipe, which is going through the pond liner, and the filtration return, which is also going through the pond liner. And I need to make sure that I've got a nice area of pond liner loose that's not being kind of restricted by the stonework, so that I can move it to work with it a little bit more easily. So I'd left a nice big gap here between the 2 bits of wall, so that I can work on this, and I haven't started that side over there yet where the filtration overflow or filtration discharge is going to go. Now, in this pond, there was already a very, very convenient overflow that had been positioned. We've got a nice 3-inch pipe which is disappearing off in some of the trenching that we've done for the drainage. We've also then added our own 1.5-inch heavy-duty pipe, which we've run through that 3-inch pipe acting as a conduit, which is discharging off down at the bottom. And this 1.5-inch pipe here, I'm going to integrate through the pond liner using one of the Awaza Tradex connectors. I use a lot of these. This is a really, really great way of running pipework or cables if you want to do so discreetly below water level. Of course, it does mean putting a hole in the pond liner, so you've got to make sure that you're very accurate before you start cutting. Now, what I would typically do is cut a hole in the pond liner at the desired height. The connector goes through, I glue one side, the other side has got a nice big flat washer, but I'll also glue that as well, just for a little bit of belt and braces. And then there's a lock nut which will secure this and clamp it up against the pond liner. Pretty foolproof. You can get away with cutting a pretty jagged hole for this. Don't have to be massively accurate because the backing plate is so much larger that will clamp up against it, which is great. And then what I would often do is to put an elbow or a joint which can be articulated if once the pond is filled up I want to try to get a bit more water in there, or want to drop the level of the pond a little bit, I can do so by articulating the joint. Now in this particular instance we're being governed by the position and the height of the overflow pipe here, which has already been set at essentially what is going to be maximum water level. So I can't go any lower, I could go higher. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fit the Tradex connector. I'm not going to build any stonework around this yet. I'll get the pond filled up so I can do a wet test, and I'll gauge what level this is going to set the pond level at. And if I feel like it wants to be higher, then I can put a 90-degree elbow on and I can bend that up slightly so I can raise the level of the pond. I have a feeling actually in this instance that I'm going to be able to get away with just using the connector on its own with a leaf guard straight onto this rather than the elbow and then a leaf guard on top. And that will keep it nice and neat and tidy. And because this is the feature wall, I want to make sure that all attention is drawn to the water blade and not to any other, albeit discreet, overflows or bits and pieces that might be more visible. So if I can get away without using that elbow, I prefer to do that. Now when you're cutting the pond liner and preparing it ready for the connector, you've got to make sure that the liner itself is clean. I like to roughen it up a little bit with a bit of wire wool or a scouring pad. Just give it a wipe over the pond liner, and that gets rid of any grease and muck and debris. On a new pond liner there's often this kind of oily film which makes it a little bit difficult for sealant to adhere to properly. So getting that rubbed off really helps, but roughening up the surface so it's a little bit more abrasive just means that the glue, the adhesive, is going to bite a little bit better on the pond liner. So I've cleaned that both sides. I've measured up. One little trick when you're cutting holes in the pond liner is, rather than pulling the liner right up to its final kind of resting position, if you cut a hole in exactly the correct position there and then you decide you want to go higher, you're stumped and you can't do that. So if you fold the liner down a little bit and end up cutting the hole higher than you think you need, this crease, this fold is going to be concealed behind stonework, so that's not a problem. But if I decide that this is too low and it needs to be lifted up, I've then got a bit of security where I can lift up that pond liner with that crease, just to give me a slight bigger margin for error. Right, in terms of sealant, my weapon of choice is wet water sticky stuff. I love this stuff. It's a very gooey black adhesive. It cures underwater, it sticks basically to anything, and it forms a very, very strong, flexible, reliable, waterproof seal. Now, as I say, this particular Tradex connector doesn't require gluing at all. That nice thick washer is plenty once you've clamped up that lock nut, but I do like to make sure that we've sort of ticked all the boxes. This is really messy stuff. If you get it on your skin, it's going to be on there for a little while, although I do find that a bit of WD-40 squirted on your skin and then wiped off probably doesn't do your skin any good, but it gets this off and off all your tools and bits and pieces as well. So when you're fitting this to the liner, the longer threaded section goes through the pond liner, and then the washer would be in the pond against that, and then finally the lock nut against that. So the first thing I've got to do is to put a bead of sealant around the face that's going to be in contact with the outside edge of the pond liner. There we go. Obviously, whenever you're putting any kind of through liner connectors, you want to make sure you're doing it on a patch of pond liner which is nice and flat and crease free. And I have noticed that over the other side of the pond, where I want to put the much larger 4-inch connector, I've actually got a very nice neat fold because it's right in the corner of the pond. So I might have to reposition that slightly, but we'll see how that goes in a minute. Right, next thing, I'm going to put a little bead of this around the washer as well. And then when this is clamped up nice and tight, all of this sealant will ooze out of the little gap, and I'll just finally run my finger around it and just smooth it out. And I'm going to put one final little bead around the lock nut as well. Now I've got the benefit of having that big holding tank storing lots of water, so I can then fill this pond back up once this is cured and dried and give it a wet test just to make sure that there are no leaks behind the pond liner before we then continue to build up stone. Now, as I say, this does cure underwater and technically I could fill it up immediately, but I do like to make sure that this is cured fully for 24 hours before I think about putting any weight in here, because if the liner gets pulled or moved, I'd rather there was some strength in this sealant. If you can hear any splashing in the background, that's Dave rescuing some water lilies and chucking them in the bowser. Sounds like you're falling in. There we go, nice and tight. Wear gloves, because it does like to get everywhere. And I'll just finish off running my finger around this just to smooth out that bead. Now, this is not going to win any beauty contests. I'm not trying to neatly seal around a bath or a shower here. This is all going to be completely concealed. So I'm not concerned if it looks a little bit crude. Despite my best efforts, I still managed to get it on my hands. And here we go. Good old WD-40. It does get it right off. See, normally I'd take my wedding ring off. Oh look, a bit of WD-40, and I've been able to. I wasn't able to take it off this morning. I take no responsibility for any carcinogenic or harmful effects this may have on you, so be warned. But all I can say is it does work. And who doesn't like the smell of WD-40 on their skin? Right, nice and clean. Doing a great job there, Dave. It's all these little jobs, keeping things tidy, that make all the difference. I miss Dave when he's not here with me. So that's both of the connectors in. We've got the overflow connector in position over here and the 4-inch connector over in the corner over there. I'll show you that properly in a little bit more detail. But right now I'm packing up and going home early because it's a Friday afternoon and I'm heading off to North Wales later on this evening to go and do a little bit of camping and hiking. So this is what I get up to in my spare time. Just come down off of the peak of Trevan, or Trevan in Welsh. Beautiful. And it's these little rivers and streams and waterfalls that give me inspiration for building my falls. I'll see you in the pond next week. I'm at 715 metres elevation, having just come down Trevan and the Glidders. And what do I find? Menianthus trifoliatus, bog bean. I am quite surprised to see that up here. Pond plants even here. Well, that was an enjoyable weekend, I have to say. My legs are a little bit achy. I'm feeling a bit shattered today from a lot of driving and a lot of late nights and early starts. But it was a fantastic weekend in the mountains, back on site in the pond. Overflow has all been connected up to this side of the pipe here. I want to be able to give both liner connections now a wet test to get the pond filled up so we can confirm that there are no leaks from here before I continue to build and get this enclosed within the stonework. The 4-inch connector for the discharge of the filter has also gone in, and we've actually started to fit the solvent weld 4-inch pipe which will run from the connector to the outlet of the filter, which I will show you in a sec. But that's all coming on nicely. So this is the liner connector, the 4-inch outlet from the filter, which will be a submersed discharge back into the pond. And this is the solvent well pipe that it's been joined to. I've just fitted it. It was a little bit fiddly, little margin for error, which seems to be quite typical of this job at the moment. So it had to be done pretty accurately, but we needed to get a length of pipe from here disappearing up behind the screen, which is where the filter is going to be positioned. So this is where the filtration system is going to be positioned and plumbed in, discreetly behind the screen here, but still nice and accessible, and as short a distance as possible to the pond. That's really important. So that 4-inch pipe is coming underground here underneath the fence, and it's connected then to a 90-degree solvent weld fitting, which is again going to bring it up vertically so we can attach another length of pipe like so. And when the filter tank is positioned on the plinth that we're shortly going to pour, the pipe work will be coming out of the side of the filter here, coming around and then connecting up to this outlet here. Again, a lot of thought has gone into the actual position of this because the UVC is going to get bolted onto the side of the filter. And it's really important that you always put into consideration access in the future for the UV. Making sure that you can remove the quartz sleeve and the electrics to access those UV tubes that should be replaced annually. Now on this setup, this Bitron, this is a Bitron Eco 120, 120 watt unit. It's going to get bolted directly onto the side of the filter, and access for the UVCs is on this side here, and that means that we can uncouple the electrics, we can slide out the ballast and the UV tubes and also the quartz sleeve when required, and we're not being hindered by this tree. This is something that's been causing me a bit of a headache. I wanted to have all of this moved over here a little bit more, but we couldn't because the tree's in the way. And if we try and flip this around 180 degrees, the UVC is then going to get interrupted by the fence. So this is the best configuration for this setup, but you need to think about all those things before you actually decide on a final resting position. Now here, I've just created some simple shuttering out of some timber that's been left lying around. It's laying in position, nice and level. This is going to be filled with concrete, and that's going to create a nice hard foundation, a firm foundation onto which we can then stand that filter. Now, again, considering discharge in the future for cleaning out the filter, having the filter elevated above ground level is going to make it a lot easier to be able to flush the system through, because the discharge from the filter for cleaning is always via gravity, which means you're really limited unless you've got a very obvious, easy place behind the filter, which is downhill from the filter to discharge into. It's going to be quite difficult to empty the filter. So once this is down, I can then put 4 blocks and raise it up as high as I want to, so that we've got enough elevation to be able to discharge the filter a considerable distance via gravity into the surrounding borders. And of course all this water and slurry from the filter is too good to waste. You don't really want to get rid of that if you can help it, and using that to water the borders or any veg patches you may have would be a really useful thing. So we want to try and hang on to that. Now this is a really simple pour, just making sure that this timber is relatively level. Now if I had my 6-foot level and I'm being very lazy and not getting it, I'd measure the diagonals to make sure that that's level. In this instance, I have already pre-checked. That's nice and level that way, make sure it hasn't moved. Yep, in the money. Now the other important thing here is when you're pouring concrete, you don't want to be pouring it directly onto the earth. This is incredibly dry, this soil. It's going to soak up the moisture from the concrete very, very quickly, making it dry out faster than we want, potentially weakening it. So, always make sure that you put a piece of membrane down, a piece of plastic, to limit contact with the soil. It's a piece of the old PVC liner which has been pre-cut. Fits in there nicely. It just slightly comes up, a bit like a sort of a bucket footprint inside there. And then, just because Mark, the owner, has got lots and lots of these rebar rods, we're going to add a pair of rods for some extra strengthening, and why not? So that's ready to pour. Now Dave's mixing the mix of ballast and cement, a 5-to-1 mix, so a little bit weaker than the sort of general mix that I'm using as a mortar base when I'm laying stonework. 5 parts ballast, and ballast is a very gritty sharp sand with sort of up to 20 mil bits of gravel and stone, mixed with a Portland cement-based cement. That'll go in here. Bit of a shimmy with a level to level it all off, and then we'll leave it, and that'll cure over the next 24 hours. Ready for the filter to stand on when we get it. Right, I reckon we've got enough in here. I'm just going around and starting to tamp the surface. I'm sort of moving up and down, bringing the moisture to the surface, which is going to make the mix an awful lot easier to trowel and move around. And it also helps to bring out any air bubbles to the surface and make sure that all of the shuttering is filled properly and that there are no hollows and voids. That makes my voice sound funny doing this. And then a nice long smooth something, piece of board. I'm going to use my level. Again, I'm going to go up and down in a kind of a tamping motion. And I'll also kind of saw it back and forth. And I'll go over this 2 or 3 times, evening out the surface. If I've obviously got some voids that are looking a little bit low, we might have to mix just a tiny bit more. Ideally 2 people doing this, one other side of the level is useful. I reckon that's pretty much perfect in terms of volume of concrete. I'll go over it one more time. Now with this sort of thing, it's best not to play with it too much. It hasn't got to be perfect. This is just a firm, solid base onto which to stand the filter. I mean, some people would even just stand it on the earth, but I wouldn't do that. Much better to have something firm underneath it. But it's not a beauty contest. Having said that, I always want it to look as good as it can do. Now, because this mix is quite wet, quite liquidy, it almost self-levels. So having to ensure that shuttering is level really helps, but it will then kind of fill and find its own level. That's it. Let's leave that. I guarantee in the morning there'll be cat footprints and all sorts around that. So we've got a couple of hours before we go this afternoon. It'll be dry enough then that I can very carefully lay across a little bit of plastic. It's in a shady position here. I'm not worried about sunlight drying it out. There's no rain forecast, but I would like to stop any debris and bits of this conifer falling down, and certainly stop any pets from walking in here, which is inevitable. But that'll do for now. Now, I won't attempt to remove this shuttering for 2 or 3 days. Although it will be firm tomorrow, it's not going to reach full density, full strength, and it's quite easy in the removal of the shuttering to then start to crack the base. So don't be too impatient, leave it for a few days and then think about removing it afterwards. And that's it for now. Look, I've been gone 10 minutes. And a crafty Robin has put his footprints in. It's always the way. Well, my concrete pad has survived unscathed apart from these little robin prints here, which look very sweet. A perfect little pair. And another little pair here. And I know just which robin that is as well. So the pond is currently at its maximum level. We're just testing the overflow, making sure that water flows through freely. And that's draining down through the overflow nicely into this lower area here. I'll let the pond drop down over the next 10-15 minutes or so until it reaches its final resting place, and I'll gauge then the depths around the marginal zones to make sure that there's enough water depth to ensure I've got 4 to 6 inches of gravel for the plants and then a few inches of water above that. But as it stands at the moment, looks like it's going to be perfect. Also been checking all of the joints, all of the through-liner connectors to make sure that there are no leaks, and then all of the solvent weld joints of the pipework. I wouldn't expect any, but it's always worth checking now before you sort of mortar into place permanently anything else, and that's all looking good. And then the last thing we're going to do is to finish off this fourth wall of stonework here. So we'll just rig up the strigs, make sure that we're following a nice square path, and then we'll be on our way. Right, quick morning snack. Cameraman's about to fall over a rock. We've drained the level of the pond down. We can now carry on and start building this side of the pond. I've stuck my trousers on. I'm not a fan of putting waders on where I'm wearing shorts. This is my new pair, by the way. I'm no longer wearing leaky waders. Right, good to go. So Dave just had a great find in the pond. Noticed some movement in the pond yesterday, and again just now noticed some ripples at the surface, and suddenly he spotted what is a great diving beetle. Fantastic, fantastic find. One of my favourite pieces of wildlife. I'm going to, please don't bite me. I'm going to try and handle it. Oh, I'm a bit squeamish. Just going to go for it. Oh, okay, look at this beauty. So this chap flies. He's got lovely, lovely big paddle feet on the rear, which he used to swim. He's a powerful predator. Okay, I'm going to put him back in the water because he's looking a bit stressed. But he'll take small fish and tadpoles. He spends a long part of his life in a larvae stage, sort of a nymph stage, looking very similar to a big dragonfly larvae in the pond. And again, at that stage, it's quite a voracious predator. And again, we'll take small fish, fry, tadpoles, and other pond life. But these guys are beautiful. Lovely. Let's pop him in the holding tank. Now, if he wants to leave, he can do, because they're airborne, they'll fly between ponds. But very nice, good spot. Good morning, Mark. This is what we're greeted with every morning. Fantastic service. So this is the new morning routine. Every day coming down, being greeted by Mark or Natalie with a fresh cup of coffee, thank you very much. And generally sorting out all of the camera equipment first before anything else. I think you're going to knock up a mix of cement.
I will, yes.
I've got to start fettling with some rock and making some usable material. And then we'll just end the day wall building yet again. That's it, sun's out, sun cream on. If anyone out there produces sun cream and fancy sponsoring me, that'll be another sponsor I'll add to my list, because it's get very expensive getting through this. Well, good morning. It's a Monday morning, a very hot one at that as well. We've had a lovely weekend, weather was fantastic, and it's starting to get a little bit hot and muggy for this kind of work now. So we'll start the day off in some shorts and short sleeves. Now, I'd like to have continued building the pond, and unfortunately we've had a delay with the remainder of the delivery of the stonework. It's going to arrive at some point this week, but rather than just halt progress entirely and wait, we're instead going to start to lay some of the paving around the outside edge of the pond. I wouldn't normally want to do this. I like to start from the deepest part of the pond and kind of work my way out until we get to the edges. But there's nothing worse than just sitting there doing nothing. So as long as we lay edging of the pond somewhere we're not going to need to get in and out too regularly, and there's not going to be much footfall, then I haven't got any issues with that. So we've popped over to Lindsay Clark's this morning. We'd removed a couple of the slabs last week from the original paving here so that we could take them away and colour match. But also, very importantly, if we start to just butt up the new paving against the old, there's going to be one long linear line of pointing, which is going to look very irregular compared to the rest of the pointing within the patio. So again, if we strategically remove a couple of pieces of stone so that we can add some smaller pieces of stone in there and bring out the joint and stagger it in a few places, then it will look like a proper continuation of the patio rather than something that's been added on sort of as an afterthought later on. In terms of colour, it's impossible to try and get an exact colour match. Even in the same palette of colours there are discrepancies and differences, but we've been able to choose from a very similar palette of colours, a range of 3 or 4 different colours and different sizes that blends in very nicely with this. Having washed the old paving, I can see that there are some greys, some slightly green, some slightly warmer kind of reddy sandstone colours, and picking those out and then picking slabs that are going to blend in with that will work very nicely. Now, before we start to lay the paving around here, the pipe work running from the pond to the filtration system and the conduit which is feeding the cables through to the electrics are all going to be concealed underneath this. So the first thing I want to do is to just give the pipe work a wet test just to make sure that there are no holes. I'm not expecting any, but still, once it's underneath the patio, it's not something I'll ever be able to see, so I want to check that now. And likewise the conduit, although we've got very gentle curves here and it should be quite easy to rod in the future and pull cables through, just to save a bit of a headache, if we run the cables through the conduit now and then leave the equipment in position, it will just make it a lot easier than potentially having to struggle and get 3 cables through once it's all permanently in place. Don't really fancy lifting the slabs afterwards to try and get the cables through. To safeguard the pond liner, because it's been very hot and sunny and we've got another hot and sunny week, I've just chucked a load more water back in the pond just to get the exposed pond liner submersed, and that's going to help to protect it from the UV. And for the time being, we will just continue with the paving. So the pipework's been wet tested. I've just attached our sump pump to the pipework in place, and then I've chucked the outlet of the pipework down the visible bit of 4-inch pipe that's exposed above ground, so now we've got water flowing back into the pond over here. And that's good, that's nice and dry, so no problems there. The next thing we're doing is we're rodding the conduit from the furthest point, which is going to be the section of conduit that feeds up to the lighting blade, so that we can feed through that strip light for the blade and leave that in position. And we'll get fed through 2 or 3 sections of conduit. But I'm annoyed because my new waders, which I've had for a week, I've just snagged them on the ornate fireplace that's in here and put a ruddy great hole in them. That's 50 quid down the drain. So we fed the cable from the light bar through the first section of conduit, which is going to be fed up through the wall and terminate at the water blade, and then that will fit inside the water blade. And then rather than leave this as one long length of conduit, where this exits at the bottom of the wall down here, it was quite a steep angle. It would have been quite difficult to get that rodded because that's underneath water, it's not going to be visible. This end of conduit just finishes here at the end of the walling, and the cable is then coming out loose. We've been able to feed the cable through that section first, then into a nice straight section of conduit that's going to run underneath the gravel, underneath the planted section of the marginal zone. And then there's a third piece, the final piece of conduit, which is where the 2 pump cables are going to then join, and those 3 cables are going to get fed through that last section. The light cable has got a little 2-pin adapter on the end of it and a little threaded collar. This bit plugs into the transformer, and then from there you've got a standard 3-core sort of rubber sheathed flex. This is a pain, obviously it's quite a bit larger and it makes it a lot harder to feed through conduits. So if you're ever leaving conduit in place for pond lighting, always make sure that you leave a really thick bore conduit or pipe so you can get that fed through. This is 1 1/4 inch, a 32mm piece of pipe. You could get that fed through a 25mm 1-inch pipe, but if you've got any tight bends, that's going to be a really tight squeeze. So much better to have a bigger bore like this. And then what we'll do is for that last section of conduit, we'll feed the tape through, the piece of wire that we're using to then pull all the cables back through. We'll attach this end and then just tape it up with some electrical tape. And then a little bit further down, we'll daisy chain onto that one of the cables for one of the pumps, and then the second cable for the second pump, and then pull all 3 through in one go. That's the plan anyway. So if you can see that on the camera, this is the fish tape, or the flexible wire that we use to feed through the conduit, tape on the cables, and then pull them back through again. Just give that a little bit of a dry because the wire's wet, having gone through into the pond. And then the cables just get taped on nice and simply with some regular electrical tape. So we've got the light cable for the water blade illumination attached to the tape now, and that's the bit with the awkward collar, so we've used that one as the first sort of leader that's going to pull through. And then onto that we've daisy chained the two slightly larger 3-core flexes for the water blade pump and the filtration pump. So now we've got all three things tethered, albeit at different stages, which can get pulled through to the next conduit. And hopefully, we measured it approximately, we've got long enough lengths of flex to come out the other end, otherwise we'll have to start shortening the conduit, which is always a pain. Right, you ready to start pulling? Go for it. Now if this is particularly tight, you can add a little bit of Vaseline or a bit of washing up liquid onto the cables, and that reduces friction and makes it a little bit easier to pull it through. But we shouldn't need that on this. Bit of a fiddly job this. Definitely an extra pair of hands makes all the difference. It's really awkward when you're trying to do this on your own. Okay, so that's pulled all the way through. Now you've got all of the slack. Plenty of space if we wanted to put a 4th or a 5th cable through here. Nah. David just suggested that if we'd left a spare bit of string in there in the future, if ever you wanted to pull something else through, you've got a string in position, and that is sensible. However, I've left another conduit at the other side of the pond, which is fully open. There's nothing inside that. So if ever we wanted to upgrade additional things to the pond, we can use that other conduit if this one's a little bit tight. Now hang on a sec, we've got the strings in the way. Honestly. Let's feed this through. I compared this to a game of Operation, all these strings. I think it's more like the Crystal Maze I said, didn't I? There we go. Keep pulling. That's it. All 3 cables successfully fed through. God, I nearly put a hole in my shorts then with that flipping fire as well. Blimey. It is, yeah. Just going to mend my waders before I sit down for my late morning snack. And thankfully, although my waders didn't come with a spare patch, Dave's did. It's not quite the same, but it'll do. So if I double side the patch inside and out, hopefully these waders will live another day. And good old wet water sticky stuff, useful for every potential waterproofing fix. Hopefully we'll come to the rescue again. Right, I'm going to let that go off before turning them back the other way around and trying to patch the outside as well. Hazards of working in the aquatics industry. Not a lot of videoing today. All I'm going to say is, it's the end of the day, it's flipping hot and it's flipping humid. I think it's about 29 degrees, possibly 30. And I know all of you people in Dubai and other foreign hot countries are going to say this isn't hot. But for us here in the UK, especially when it's the first hot period of the year, it feels hot. It's not ideal weather for cementing. It's been going off very quickly. However, we've been pouring some concrete all around the edges just to bring up that final level a little bit so that when I start to lay slabs, I'm not having to sit them on too thick a base of mortar. Along this back wall here, I have actually laid slabs all the way along, and we've started to bring out the original paving to the pond edge as well. So tomorrow when I uncover the pond, there'll be something to look at. Looks nice as well. I'm pleased with how it's looking. The dragonflies have been dancing over the pond all day long. Lots and lots of what I've looked into are called broad-body darters or broad-body chasers. A lovely dragonfly, although now I'm saying that I can't see any. It's probably a bit too hot for them as well. But pack up, home time, and a nice cold San Miguel are waiting for me when I get home. You looking forward to a nice cold beer, Dave?
Yes, I am.
Well, good morning. It is a Monday morning and it's a good start to the day because Lindsay Clarks have finally had their delivery of rock. So we've been over and picked up that last ton of outstanding rock so I can crack on and start doing some more wall building. Now, the majority of the paving around the edge of the pond has been completed. As I say, it's not really the order of affairs typically when I'm building ponds, but it meant that we could continue doing some work and not get any interruptions whilst we were waiting for the materials to arrive. And it's really nice to see this come down. It's all gone in beautifully. All the lines nice and square and meet up nicely. So the next job is going to be to get the pond dropped back down again lower than that internal rock shelf level and start to build that internal collar of stone which acts as the retainer for all of the marginal shelving. Now before I do, I'm going to just do a last few couple of checks with the laser and check low spots against what will be the overflow, against any potential areas where the pond liner could be lower. Again, only as an absolute precaution, but because the overflow is fixed, it hasn't got an articulated joint to maintain or to alter levels. I've got to make sure that that internal shelf is put in at just the right depth now. Otherwise, when the pond is filled up, it's too late. So a lot of stone to bring down from the van, a lot of materials to start prepping again, get the pond drained, get these levels checked, and then start building. Mark's been really busy getting rid of all of the turf and the lawn. You've probably noticed, and it's not something I've mentioned during the video, that more and more soil is becoming visible and less grass, and that's because Mark is taking the opportunity, whilst we're making a mess over here, to make a bit more mess in the garden, to dig up a lot of building material, plastic, rubble and bits and pieces that have been left in here, and improve the quality of the lawn as a result. Well, the weather's finally broken, and this morning, after about 3.5 weeks or so of no rain whatsoever, we've had some rain, and actually some decent rain. The garden did really need it. It was quite heavy, and I was a little bit concerned that with the pond as empty as it was, there could be repercussions with the liner starting to lift again, but everything's fine, so that's great. I had a quick nose down at the 4-inch pipe that we diverted all of the water down to the bottom of the garden, and that's chucking out water a lot more steadily this morning. So that's just goes to show that even with a small amount of rain, that pipe is being fed directly from something. So I'm glad that we dealt with that and got rid of it away from the pond entirely. It's supposed to be dry for the rest of the day, so with a bit of luck I'll make some good progress and be able to continue with that internal collar of rock and get the majority of that done. I've picked up another load of rock from Lindsay Clarks this morning. So that's the 4th ton in all on this job, and that should be enough to see me through into getting the feature wall done as well, and fingers crossed. So, shall continue and keep building. So this inner ring of stone is going in nicely. Thankfully it's not quite as labour intensive or time consuming as laying the main wall in. It's a little bit less visible as it's deeper down in the pond, and the majority of this side is concealed with gravel, so the stones can be laid a little bit more rapidly with a little bit less care. So we're speeding through this quite quickly. So most of this rock has been cut to make sure it's a uniform width to lay, and then from this it can be split and gauged in various different thicknesses. Taking a level off of the overflow to make sure that when I lay the stone down I've got a few inches of water above the stone, but not too much. So this is going in nicely. As always, it's just the standard sort of general duty mix that we use, a 4-to-1, 2 sharp, 2 soft, 1 cement, a little bit of plasticizer to make it a bit more workable. And thankfully the rain has held off today for us, so we don't have to worry about the gazebo. Now some of you may notice that at the bottom of this screen, somewhere down here near the description, you've also got a little button called Super Thanks. That's a new addition to the channel. When I hit, I think it was 5,000 subscribers, it was something that YouTube just added automatically to the channel. And the Super Thanks is kind of a digital donations jar or tip jar. and I hadn't expected anybody to use it, although if you click on it, it then gives you sort of generic totals that you can click on if you're feeling particularly generous and want to tip me for any of the advice that I'm giving you. But a chap called Kevin Oakes did tip me last week. So Kevin, thank you very, very much. Very generous of you, and there was no need to do that, but much appreciated. Thank you. Right, a little over halfway, and I'll crack on. So I'm nearing completion of that internal ring of stone. I'm going to stop and not bother doing this section just yet so that I've got easier access to complete the feature wall. But we've just had another delivery this morning, and good old Lindsay Clarks have turned up with a couple of tons of gill mill gravel. So Dave's been very busy brushing out all of these marginal zones, getting rid of all the cement and the muck that's in there so that he can pour the gravel straight in. Come closer. So the bulk of the filling is going to be with this 10mm gill mill. Gill mill is a lovely water-worn gravel, nice colours that work really, really well with the York stone. Not quite as harsh or as sort of strong as a shingle. I think it looks a lot nicer underwater, and it's rounded, so you've got a lot less chance of damaging liner should any of this fall into the pond. It's nice to walk on, it's soft, it compacts down nicely, and from a growing point of view, the plants want to grow into the finer aggregates. So the bulk of this is filled with the 10mm, and then it's a finished dressing of a couple of inches with the larger 20mm, which helps to stop any fish that might get into the shallows from rummaging around and uprooting some of the plants. Lovely stuff.